Hello, Loretto Community. This is Sister Marie Lord Steckler, and I'll be walking you through this presentation today on behalf of the Motherhouse Land Preservation Working Group. Our working group consists of Jessie Rathburn, Susan Clausen, Sister Sharon Cassing, Sister Mary Catherine Rabbit, Sister Marie Ego, and myself. Our work began when the Loretto Community passed the following proposal in 2018. The Loretto Community committed itself to a 3-year process of study and education, leading to decision-making in 2021 regarding ways to preserve the Motherhouse lands which we hold sacred. Since then, we have facilitated community-wide discussions in community groups and regional meetings and gathered input from preservation specialists. In 2019, the community overwhelmingly agreed to pursue a conservation easement with the Bluegrass Land Conservancy. Earlier this year, in spring community groups, you discussed how we want to protect our woodlands and waterways. For today's presentation, we're bringing you voices from the Bluegrass Land Conservancy to tell you more about their organization, to answer your questions, and to place our land within the broader land preservation movement. First, we'll start with greetings from Jessie Wilder, the Executive Director of the Bluegrass Land Conservancy, and Dr. Lyda Oxnard, a fellow local landowner who has already protected her land with a conservation easement.
Bluegrass Land Conservancy is a nonprofit land trust. So we protect land across the Bluegrass region of Kentucky through a tool that you guys have heard of called conservation easements. We are first and foremost a nonprofit, so we are governed by a board of directors. Our board of directors are landowners and community members from across the region, and they guide what it is that we do and the way in which we service the community in line with our mission and our vision as an organization. That mission for us is to protect land in the Bluegrass region through permanent conservation easements. Our vision is to create a community that exists, that is protected in perpetuity for human health, environmental health, and the health of our community as a whole. We envision a future where land is protected across the region and that assists in our local communities and the health of the entire area. When I like to think and talk about land preservation with people, I like to think that we are trying to set a basis for what we find important on the land, and that can be protecting soil, water, air, all of the important elements that go along with land conservation that are inherent to preserving a piece of land. Those can also include our larger communities, our wildlife community that enjoys and utilizes the land, a larger community of people that you might invite out onto the land. And it can also include future generations and future communities that might come and explore and utilize a piece of land as well. We were formed in 1995 by a group of landowners around the Lexington area who grew very worried and concerned with the pace of development in the area and the amount of farmland in particular, but also natural lands that were being developed in ways that didn't seem to have a lot of thought or consideration into how they were going to affect the future communities of the area. And this group of landowners had some experience with other parts of the country where land conservation had been happening. And they felt like the answer, or one of the many answers, for the region was to create a land trust that could proactively work with landowners across the region to allow them to protect their land that they felt like was important. Again, both agricultural land and natural lands across originally Fayette County and surrounding counties, but that has now expanded all the way up through the Louisville region, all the way down through this area of the Bluegrass as well. So we were formed in 1995 by this group of landowners and community members who had a vision for a different type of community where decisions were made a little bit more intentionally and resources were being thought about and protected for future generations. Since then, as an organization, we have protected 136 farms and natural areas across the Bluegrass on over 28,000 acres of land, which is incredible. Each of those pieces has a story that goes with it, has a history to the land, and now has a future that will always be there for future generations. So it's really special work that we do. We also, with that, we have a lot of active easements that we're working on right now. We have over 5,000 acres that we're working on with landowners right now, you guys being one of many groups that we're working with to protect land. So there is a growing knowledge of land conservation. I think there's a growing understanding of its importance in the region, and we're seeing that in the responsiveness of landowners across the region when we send information and when they attend gatherings. We're seeing that responsiveness grow. So I think that land conservation in central Kentucky is going to be something that we see in the next years as something that is really growing conversation-wise, and I think we're going to see a lot more land that's being conserved.
Hello, Loretto Community. We're standing in Nelson County in a field that I purchased a few years ago, which is connected to some land that I purchased many years ago, probably 20 years ago. It's right down over the hill, and I'm building a small, environmentally sustainable home down there. Susan's with me and Jesse are with me, and I'm here to tell you how important it is that we protect the land, because if we don't, we will not have the land to protect us. I believe I'm a little more emotional today because we're in the midst of the COVID epidemic, and we have many places in our country going up in smoke. And it's an exceedingly trying time, and I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. That is all the more reason for us to determine what we're going to do with our future and determine how we're going to protect everything that we're able to look at around us. We are so fortunate to live in an area like this. Unfortunately, it is being subdivided, and that's all right. Many of us need homes, but we also have to make certain that we have enough energy left to protect the land. So what are we doing here? One thing that we're doing here, and I know you can't see around me, but I can see hundreds of milkweed that will bring in the monarch butterfly, which we already did at Loretto. Also, you don't see the crop of Johnson grass, which I've now killed 2 years in a row and probably will be killing for the next number of years that I live. You don't see the multiflora rose that's, well, you do see if you can see behind me, but we're going to try to eradicate that. We're also trying to get rid of other invasive species. So that's one of the things that we're doing here. We also have turned this land, turned the development rights of this land over to the Bluegrass Nature Conservancy so that the land will not be able to be developed in the future. The land, I'm allowed to have a home on it. I'm allowed to have farm buildings on it because it's essentially working as a small farm. I'm allowed to have a pasture up here, and I'm allowed to have more farm buildings. I'm not allowed to put down a bunch of concrete. I'm not allowed to have a feed lot. I'm not allowed to put buildings along the road to change the road frontage because the Bluegrass Land Conservancy wants people to be able to see that there's some wild land left. So the things that they're doing, I think, are very important. They keep the land in their conservancy for perpetuity. They have the funds to protect it when I'm long gone. And they're my best shot. I have children who are very interested in the land also and are helping me with the non-native species and the invasive species, but I realize that I have no control over them in generations to come, although I'm doing my best. I'm telling you this because I realize you've got the property and you've got property that can take care of so many creatures in the future, now and in the future. So anyway, we just do our best. Protect Mother Nature. She'll take care of us.
Before we jump into more content, let's get to know more professionals from the Bluegrass Land Conservancy and hear why they are interested in this kind of work.
Hi, my name is Jessie Wilder and I'm the Executive Director of Bluegrass Land Conservancy. I've been working at the Conservancy for about 7 years now. I've always had a passion for conservation and particularly for land stewardship. I grew up in a small church in Woodford County, and they had a whole section that we would do every summer on the importance of this idea of stewardship of land. And we had speakers such as Wendell Berry come and talk to us when we were kids, and it made such a huge impression on me, this idea that we were stewards of God's creation. And that stuck with me throughout life. And as I was older and I was working as an engineer, I had a moment where I was not feeling very fulfilled with what I was doing in life. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and we were actually talking about stewardship and land stewardship in particular, and what that meant to be stewards of the land and stewards of the earth. And I got off the phone with her and immediately started looking for jobs in the environmental field, just any job I could find. And I found an advertisement that night for a job for stewardship coordinator at an organization called the Bluegrass Conservancy. And I thought, that's a job that I need to apply for. So I applied for the job, and it was actually due that evening. So I applied for it, and that started my journey with the Bluegrass Land Conservancy. I love the work that we do. It's incredible. I worked for several years as our stewardship coordinator, and then when our executive director left a few years ago, I stepped in as the director. But I think what draws me to it is the connection with the land and with the people who are protecting their land. There's an immense amount of love there for most everybody that we work with. People love the land that they're on, and they want to ensure that it is protected in perpetuity, that this resource and connection that they have with it is always going to be there and be available for people in the future. And I personally have seen that. I saw it as stewardship coordinator. It's a hard thing to describe, but the protection of a piece of land both changes the people that are protecting it and the land itself. And there's an added level of peace, I think, that comes to land and to the people that own the land when they've made the decision and they know that a piece of land is going to be protected in certain ways forever. It makes a big difference. And to me, I love that I get to do that every day with what I do, and I get to see those differences that will last forever.
My name is Ashley Greathouse, and I have worked for Bluegrass Land Conservancy since 2007. I'm their counsel and director of conservation, and I feel so fortunate to have a position with the organization where I get to work with landowners on helping them close conservation easements on their land. I became interested in land conservation before I went to law school, and I actually wrote my entrance law school essay on land conservation and conservation easements. And it was still a relatively new field in the world of property law, but it was just something that was beginning, especially in our region. And the Bluegrass Land Conservancy, actually it started in 1995. So I did a little research on the organization and asked some questions and learned a little bit more about what land conservation was and conservation easements, and really started out my path in my legal career hoping that I could work in conservation. So I felt very lucky when I did find out after I graduated that there was a position available to do legal work for Bluegrass Land Conservancy, and interviewed and got the job, and I've been there ever since. So we have been able to protect, 28,000 acres over the course of 25 years since the organization started, and we are continuing to do more work on wonderful properties and have expanded our service area actually quite a lot in the past couple of years. So that is why I like land conservation.
I'm Emmanuel Fields, and I've been the stewardship coordinator for Bluegrass Land Conservancy since 2018. What really attracted me to work at BLC was the conservation that it does. Growing up, I always found myself kind of completely attracted to playing outside, everything outdoors. And then even when I got to college, I studied environmental anthropology, which was something that really stuck with me because there I learned the relationship between the environment and people and how they both influence each other. And growing up, kind of a small town kid, I watched all of my friends, how they constantly were saying how bored they were when I was kind of constantly finding things to do outside. But as I became older, I started to watch a lot of those places that I used to play on disappear due to certain development. And so I remember wanting to I remember feeling that there was something I wanted to do coming out of college, but kind of feeling almost a helpless type of feeling, like, yeah, I can only do so much when it comes to conservation and protecting the areas I love. But then once I found out about Bluegrass Land Conservancy and that I found out there was actually something tangible that I felt that I could do to where I wouldn't feel so helpless or powerless, I immediately jumped at the opportunity. And luckily they liked me enough to where they brought me on. And I've said this before, but I definitely have the best job in the whole place. I get to play on all the farms. I get to check out all the properties before and after they are protected. And I mostly just get to do what I love, and that's kind of be outdoors.
In preparing for this time together, the Motherhouse Land Preservation Working Group went back through all the feedback and questions we have received from you over the years. Some of your questions have already been answered in community group discussions and regional meetings. Others we know would be better answered by land conservation professionals. We took all those questions, organized them by theme, and asked the people of the Bluegrass Land Conservancy to respond. First, you will hear about the state of land preservation in other areas of the country and how Kentucky's land preservation efforts compare.
Land conservation across the country is a growing conversation that is happening. There's areas of the country, I guess there's pockets of the country that have been in the forefront of land conservation for years. So if you look at some of the states in the Northeast, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Vermont, they have a really strong background in land conservation, and a lot of land has been conserved. The same thing is true out west in a lot of the western states, so Colorado, California, a lot of those areas. Wyoming have a very strong history of land conservation and support of land conservation. There's also some areas that are growing. So we're seeing along the east coast of the United States really a growing conversation in places like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, where land conservation is really, the pace of it is really starting to pick up. The same thing is really happening in the Midwest right now around agricultural land and farm resources. There's an increased pace of conservation that we're seeing happening. The Southeast, or kind of where we would consider Kentucky being, it's still a growing conversation here. We have pockets like the Bluegrass region where when we compare ourselves regionally to other parts of the country, we rank really well with the amount of conservation that we're doing. When we look at Kentucky as a whole, a full state, there's a lot that still needs to be done for the conversation of conservation, and there's other states that are ahead of us in that because they have more funding at the state level towards conservation that we don't have in Kentucky or that we haven't been able to gain yet. But again, in the Bluegrass region, the conversation about land conservation has been really strong and it's been really growing. And we have, every time we send out information, we get more people who contact us who are interested in doing the work. And if you compare us region-wise with other regions across the country, it's a very strong area for us as an organization and as a state. About 3 or 4 years ago, the Bluegrass Land Conservancy expanded our region to include Washington and Marion County areas. So since then, we have been working to get the word out to landowners and actively work in land conservation in this region. Prior to that time, there really wasn't anybody who was focused on this area of the state for conservation, even though it's such an amazing area, resource-wise and land-wise. So starting then, we started a lot of conversations, started conversations with the religious round table. Since that time, we have worked and closed an easement with one landowner on about 700 acres on the Marion, Washington County border. We also have in conversation, we have a number of active easements on several hundred acres when you add them all up between all of the people that we're working with. So this is an area where we're seeing a lot of growth in the conversation about land conservation, and we really think that with some more focus that this area is going to see a lot of land conservation and we're going to see a lot of successes. We've been very encouraged by the response that we've received in the community thus far, and anticipate having more focused educational opportunities for people and really trying to grow land conservation here. We are currently working with several religious communities. We don't have any who have gone all the way through the easement process yet. Of course, it's quite a process, and everybody has their own process and their own timelines for that. But we are moving forward very positively with all of the groups that we're working with, and we do really feel in good faith, and I know they feel in good faith, that all of these conversations are going to end with a conservation easement on all the separate pieces of land that are held by the religious entities, and that would be an incredible accomplishment for this area to see that.
We are seeing more frequent and more extreme effects of climate change all the time. And several of you have asked about the connections between the preservation of land and climate disruption. In this clip, Jessie will help us understand those connections.
Land conservation relates to climate disruption in two main ways, I think. The first is that it can be a tool in combating the intensity that we might see of climate disruption in the future. So by protecting a large swath of land, we're protecting a resource from potential development that would contribute more to climate disruption that we're seeing. And instead, we're protecting that resource forever. And so with that, we're protecting the opportunity for the land and the resources on the land, the trees, the grass, the plant life, to help us in the ways that we know that it tries to do. So by protecting a piece of land, we're making more of that available in the future, and we're taking away the possibility that it would be developed in a way that would contribute more to the climate disruption and the pace of climate disruption that we're seeing. The second way that land conservation relates to climate disruption and can help is in the form of resiliency farmland. So one of the things that we're discovering as people are looking more into climate disruption and what's happening is there's been a lot of research into the way that it's going to affect different parts of the world. And areas of the world that are going to be more resilient with resources and could possibly provide areas for us that we are going to need in the future. The American Farmland Trust is a national organization. They've been doing a lot of research on resiliency of farmland across the country, and they're actually releasing reports right now, and one of those reports shows that farmland in Kentucky is actually one of the areas that is high on the resiliency scale. So our farmland, our soil resources, and the way that we think that it's going to be affected and that our climate is going to be affected, Kentucky is actually one of the areas, and our farmland is one of the areas that's most important for our resiliency, because it seems like we're still going to be able to grow food here and utilize our resources on an environmental level to help people. And so that is something that we feel like is really important when we're looking at land for conservation and when we're thinking about, why it's important to protect some of these resources in perpetuity, is because number one, they can help mitigate what we might see by utilizing the resources on the property. And the second is that when we look at resiliency, Kentucky in particular and our farmland is really going to be important in the future for us to have available.
Since agriculture is so crucial to this area, we asked Jesse to expand on how conservation easements promote agriculture and how our values around agriculture can be written into a conservation easement.
One opportunity that a conservation easement can provide is for young and new farmers to be able to step into the world of farming and of land ownership. When a conservation easement is on a piece of land and the land goes up for sale, the land is sold at agricultural values rather than development values. And so that provides an opportunity for a young landowner or a young new farmer to get into the business and to be able to have access to land that they might not be able to have access to otherwise if they're having to bid against developers in getting a piece of land. It's of course important for conservation easements to be flexible for future generations and to be a document that is relevant for future generations as well. So when we look for other things that we can put in the conservation easement, for instance, regenerative agriculture, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are allowing for future knowledge and innovation as well. So, for instance, in the world of agriculture, best practices have changed. Our knowledge of best practices has changed vastly over the last 10 years even, going from best management practices to sustainable agriculture to regenerative agriculture. And hopefully in the future, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, we understand even more how to be better stewards of our land while we're also growing resources for us to eat and to sustain us. And so we want to make sure that an easement allows for those things, that the focus of the easement is that we are taking something off the table. So we're taking the possibility of major commercial development or turning the area into a neighborhood off the table, and that what we're doing instead is we're saying this is the basis of why we want to protect this land, and we can set some priorities of making sure that our practices are in line with stewarding the land in the best way possible, and that we can also allow that language to be open enough that as we learn more in the future, we're able to have the best practices possible moving forward.
In the next section, we asked many of the questions you have posed about the specifics of conservation easements. In a nutshell, what is allowed in a conservation easement?
What we can do on a conservation easement property is build future residential structures that are limited by the terms of the conservation easement that are negotiated with the community. We can also do divisions of the property that are also limited by the terms of that conservation easement. And our standard language is a division of not less than 50 acres. We can do farming activities and other open space, outdoor types of activities on the property. Really.
And in a nutshell, what is not allowed in a conservation easement?
High-density residential development would not be allowed under the conservation easement. Non-agricultural commercial activities would not be allowed under the conservation easement unless they were specifically prescribed in the language itself in the easement. Anything that would impair the conservation values that are stated in the conservation easement would be prohibited. But all of this is negotiated between the Loretto community and the land trust before any document is signed. So the community does have an element of control as to what those conservation values are and what we are protecting as far as what would impair them in the future.
We've heard the terms agricultural use several times in our gatherings and discussions. What does that actually mean?
Agricultural use is defined for us by the Kentucky Revised Statutes, and we actually do define it additionally in our conservation easement. So as that does change over time, we define that differently in our conservation easement over time, but we also like to have a very broad, expansive view of that and want to allow for future changes in agriculture as we move forward in time. We do consider woodlands and open space as part of agriculture. Agroforestry is something that we actually speak specifically to in our conservation easement. And also a conservation easement by its nature is an open space easement. Farmland, the preservation of farmland and forested land is actually within the definition of the IRS of open space. So we consider that altogether as one. And we can speak to those different zones essentially within a property separately, but we do consider those all agriculturally relevant to our conservation easements.
How would a conservation easement affect other entities on the Motherhouse campus? Specifically, the possibility of an intentional, sustainable community and the retreat centers.
There are multiple ways that you could start an intentional community on the land at Loretto. One possible option would be to carve out a certain amount of land, and we would not have any involvement in what is decided as part of that intentional community, which would probably be the easiest way to move forward if you don't have plans in place and if you don't know how large that community is going to be and the number of houses that would be planned for that community. We can also do an intentional community on the Loretto property in a limited building area that we could create as an overlay that would allow us to design that vision in the conservation easement and speak to that in the document so that in the future, whenever that time comes, the community can go ahead with those plans and move forward with the intentional community. So it really could happen a number of ways, and that's something that we would discuss in the negotiations between Loretto and the Land Trust as we build that conservation easement and the vision for the community. Similarly to the intentional community, we could have an overlay that would allow for that retreat center to be expanded in the future. We could discuss the amount of future cabins that would be allowed in that space, and also the acreage that they would like that future retreat center would like to encompass. Alternatively, and similarly to the intentional community, we could carve that portion of the conservation easement out to allow for more flexibility over time.
What does it mean to carve out part of the property from the conservation easement?
There are multiple ways that we can carve out different parts of the property to do different activities on those parts of the property. One way is an actual legal survey that would have a legal description. The other possibility is to have an overlay, which we have discussed multiple times, which would be the ability to have that land protected, but there would be an area of the entire farm, a portion of the whole farm that would have an overlay and it would be treated separately than the rest of the farm. So while part of the farm would be used for agricultural purposes, for instance, an overlay area could be used for limited building and limited commercial activity or retreat space. So the cons of having part of the farm carved out is that there is potential for unintended development and unintended uses of the property in the future that are contiguous to this farm that is protected in perpetuity. So I do think it's important to be aware that anything that is not protected by the conservation easement is able to be sold for development purposes. And while that would probably not happen with the Loretto community, it is possible in the future, if it does change hands, that person could then sell it to someone that could then develop the property. So that would be a con of carving out certain areas of the farm with legal descriptions that are not included in the conservation easement. While when you do an overlay, even though you treat those areas separately than the remainder of the conservation easement, they are still protected with a conservation easement. They just have more flexibility. There are multiple ways to carve out areas and then add them into a conservation easement in the future. One possibility is an amendment to a conservation easement, which is allowed if you're adding conservation value or acreage to an existing conservation easement. So the easement can be amended in the future to add additional acreage. Also,
how would a conservation easement affect the nature preserve cemetery?
A conservation easement would not affect the green burial grounds. We would be able to do an overlay, like we discussed earlier in the conversation, where we could protect the green burial grounds with an added layer of restrictions, so that, for instance, the grounds could not be disturbed, whereas in other parts of the property there would be able to be farming activities and trails built and all of those sorts of things. So we would do an overlay over the green burial grounds, and you all in the Loretto community would work with us to create terms and restrictions to accomplish their goals for the green burial ground.
Several scenarios have been thought of over the years within the Loretto community about the future possibilities for this property. We do not see this happening anytime soon, but we want to know if they could happen, if a conservation easement is established. A co-op model for immigrants in which they might live, grow crops, and create self-sufficiency.
A co-op model for immigrants in which they would live, work, and create a model for self-sufficiency would be something that we would be happy to consider in a conservation easement. We've not done that before, but we're always open to new ideas and drafting language to accommodate future plans for our landowners.
Renewable energy generation, both for our own property and for the larger grid.
Renewable energy generation for this property would be entirely possible, and we do have several farms that have solar panels to service the barns and the houses that are located on those properties already. We do have specific language in our easements that prohibit selling that energy back to the grid. However, this is a non-deductible conservation easement, so we have a lot more flexibility when we draft, and it would be something we could consider. The only limitation would be that it could not cover more than 2% of the impervious surface of the property. So for instance, if there was a solar farm, we would just have to make sure that those solar panel pads were not covering more than 2% of the impervious surfaces of the property.
A farm school or incubator farms.
Farm schools and incubator farms would be encouraged under the terms of the conservation easement. Education is something that we do allow in our easements, and we would be happy to accommodate that type of an activity on the property.
Expanded environmental education programming.
Environmental education programming is also something that we would encourage on the property, and anything that brings the public to the land and teaches them about conservation, farming, wooded areas, and just really gets people out onto properties is something that we also encourage.
Earth-oriented, simple living workshops, soap making, green building, gardening and preserving food, raising backyard livestock, etc.
Workshops that get people onto the property to teach them about giving back to their community or creating crafts that are dealing with agritourism or livestock farming in general are also something that we do encourage. Keep in mind that we do not do public access conservation easements generally, so any easement that we do hold is not accessible to the public unless the landowner specifically allows for that. So that is not a requirement of a conservation easement. That's something that you're inviting the public to do as a part of your programming, and it is not required by the conservation easement.
Is it possible to reserve some land for potential sale if our finances become such that we need money to care for the sisters?
Yes, there are two ways that you could do that. We could carve out portions of the property like we discussed earlier and have those portions of the property not covered by the conservation easement, or we could have future divisions allowable in the conservation easement so that you could sell off portions of the land that would still be subject to the terms of the conservation easement, and you would have the security moving forward that they would be farmed essentially or kept as open space in wooded areas in perpetuity.
If a conservation easement is established, can the property be seized by eminent domain?
There is no legal instrument that can protect against eminent domain or a taking by the federal government, local government, or state government. Unfortunately, Bluegrass Land Conservancy conservation easements are not able to do that. However, we are a partner in the conversation for any taking of properties, and we will work with the landowner, and we will work with the taking entity to make sure that it's done properly and that there are mitigating factors considered in any sort of widening of the road, for instance. And we would work with the with the property owner to make sure that the most advantageous route with the road widening would be taken.
Are there any pitfalls to establishing a conservation easement on a piece of property? What happens in the future if the landowner and the Bluegrass Land Conservancy have a disagreement about what should happen on the land?
Potential pitfalls for a conservation easement are that the document is in perpetuity. I would say that that is the number one concern for a landowner moving forward. It can be a pitfall, or it can be the number one motivating factor to do the conservation easement, but I would say just that concept of perpetuity is very difficult for people to understand. However, Bluegrass Land Conservancy and other land trusts across the country have tried to create enough flexibility in our documents to allow for landowners to be able to move forward through time and know that different methods of farming and different uses for open space should be accommodated through our conservation easements. If there is a disagreement between the land trust and the landowner for a conservation easement, the land trust does its very best to work that out with the landowner very quickly and upfront and with transparency. Our goal is to have a good relationship with our landowners. This is a long-term relationship, and we really want to do our best to make everyone happy in this arrangement. However, there are times when there are violations of our conservation easements, and if that happens, we are required to uphold the terms of our conservation easements. And so even in that situation, we will work with the landowner to try to figure out a way to mitigate whatever damage has been done, to put the land back to the position that it was in before the violation happened, and to move forward amicably in that process. We also do have an insurance group that does cover our claims if there is a violation of our terms of our conservation easements. This typically happens when the land is sold and there's a second generation landowner that potentially comes onto the property and doesn't understand the restrictions that are associated with the land. And if that happens and someone does violate the easement, we can use that insurance to pay for our legal defense to get that property restored to the position that it was in prior to the violation. So we actually have had to use it once in the past. We're actually currently in a situation right now with a second generation landowner, and we are working with them and still trying to make it all work, but Terra Firma is helping us with our legal fees so that we can continue to enforce the terms of our easement and uphold our promises to the public.
Now we will hear a brief description of how the Bluegrass Land Conservancy will first document what is already here on our property and what the annual monitoring would look like if a conservation easement is established.
We document conservation values by mainly creating our baseline documentation report, which is myself and usually one or two other people of our team. We will come out and we will gather a whole lot of data on the property. We will take that data and we will produce reports and all sorts of maps, precise GPS coordinates, all sorts of information, and then we will combine them all into a very neat, streamlined baseline documentation report that's easy to follow and easy to read. Okay, stewardship of the property after the conservation easement. That is something that is directly tied to the annual monitoring of the property, which what the monitoring is annually I will set up an appointment with the property owner or the manager, and I will come out to the property, and that's when it's kind of a boots on the ground situation where I will kind of walk the entire property mostly. I'm looking for all sorts of things like non-native invasive that might have moved in, new wildlife habitat, and this is also a really good time for me to talk to the property owner or the manager to find out if they have any plans in the future to put up any new structures or just do any kind of maintenance work like that. And when that happens, we usually ask that we have some type of written notice.
Many of our questions have related to the uncertainty of the future. We don't know what we will be called to do in 10, 50, 60, or 100 years. The idea of perpetuity can also be daunting. Many have articulated questions around making a decision that will be enforced forever. With all these questions in mind, we asked Jesse Wilder to speak to how we might move forward with a conservation easement and still provide flexibility for future mission.
So the idea of perpetuity and a conservation easement can be very daunting. And I think that one way to think about it is to think about a conservation easement as being something that is taking one future possibility off the table. And that future possibility is to develop the land in a major commercial way or as a residential development, a full residential development. So it's taking those two possibilities off the table, and it's leaving most other possibilities open. What it's also doing is it's setting a basis for the community and for future generations or for future owners to have a basis of understanding, a foundation that everybody's standing on when they're making decisions about the land. So we can't predict what people are going to want to do in 50 years or 200 years from now. We can't predict what's going to be best for the community at that point in time. We can't predict what's going to be needed at that point in time. But what we can say is we can say that the protection of land is important. It's inherently important to the world. It's important to our spiritual connections. It's important to ourselves and our livelihood as humans. It's important to the environment, even if humans aren't here. It's important to wildlife. It's important on so many levels. And so a conservation easement is essentially saying we agree that this is important, and that the stewarding of the natural resources on this land are something that we feel like is a basis for the decisions that we're going to make as a community moving forward, and that we're going to set this as the ground that we kind of all agree to and make our decisions on in the future. So I like to think of it less as being something that, a way in which you're restricting the future and future conversations and future generations, as much as you are kind of setting the framework for the way in which they hold conversations. Just like many things in life, sometimes having a little bit of framework of restriction can really allow the best ideas to come forward and the best conversations to take place. And so by setting a framework and saying, one of our main priorities here is stewarding this land and making sure that this resource is taken care of in perpetuity, you're allowing future generations to take that and say, okay, this is important. This has been agreed upon by our community as being important. And so therefore, that's where we're standing. And now all of the decisions that we're going to make are going to come and be stemmed from that. So they'll still be able to make decisions about trails on the property and uses. There's a lot of options for flexibility, for ways in which the community can grow and change. There's a lot of ways that we can work with that. It's really just creating, again, a common ground for everybody to stand on when we're having conversations about the future.